The first time Emily Carter saw the homeless man on the street, she didn't think twice. He was just another face in the crowd, another nameless figure begging for spare change. But when she mocked him, when she looked him in the eye and told him to get a job, she had no idea who he really was. She didn't know he was Shaquille Thompson, a self-made millionaire testing the kindness or cruelty of strangers. She didn't know he was about to turn her life upside down. And she certainly didn't know that her moment of arrogance would spark a chain of events that would expose a hidden world of power, corruption, and danger. But now, as she stares at the bullet on her kitchen table, polished to a shine, with a note that reads, "You should have stayed out of this," Emily realizes one thing. She's no longer the woman who mocked a homeless man. She's the woman who took down a criminal empire. And she's the woman they'll do anything to silence. The question is, can she survive long enough to finish what she started? The sun was setting over the bustling city, casting long shadows across the pavement. The streets were alive with the hum of conversation, the clatter of heels, and the occasional honk of a taxi. Among the crowd, a man sat slumped against a brick wall, his face hidden beneath a tattered hoodie. His hands were rough, his clothes dirty, and a cardboard sign rested at his feet. "Anything helps. God bless." Most people walked past without a second glance, but not her. Emily Carter was the kind of woman who turned heads wherever she went. With her designer handbag, perfectly tailored coat, and a confidence that radiated like a spotlight, she was the picture of success. She was on her way to meet friends for dinner at a trendy new restaurant, her heels clicking sharply against the sidewalk. But when she spotted the homeless man, she stopped. "Ugh, another one," she muttered under her breath, loud enough for the man to hear. She wrinkled her nose as if the mere sight of him offended her. "Don't you people ever get tired of begging? Why don't you just get a job?" The man looked up, his eyes hidden behind a pair of cheap sunglasses. His face was unshaven, his expression unreadable. He didn't respond, just tilted his head slightly as if studying her. Emily rolled her eyes and reached into her purse. For a moment, it seemed like she might drop $1 into his cup, but instead, she pulled out a compact mirror, checked her reflection, and snapped it shut. "Honestly, it's people like you who ruin this city," she said, her voice dripping with disdain. "If you put half as much effort into finding work as you do sitting here, maybe you wouldn't be in this mess." The man remained silent, but a faint smile tugged at the corner of his lips. Emily didn't notice. She adjusted her bag, tossed her hair over her shoulder, and strode off, her heels echoing down the street. What she didn't know, what she couldn't possibly have guessed, was that the man she'd just mocked wasn't who he appeared to be. Underneath the dirt and the disguise was Shaquille "Shaq" Thompson, a self-made millionaire with a net worth of over $50 million. He wasn't homeless. He wasn't even struggling. He was conducting an experiment, one that would change Emily's life, and his own, forever. Shaq watched Emily disappear into the crowd, his mind racing. He'd seen her type before, beautiful, privileged, and utterly oblivious to the struggles of others. But there was something about her that intrigued him. Maybe it was the way she'd looked at him, as if he were less than human. Or maybe it was the challenge of proving her wrong. He stood up, brushed off his pants, and pulled out his phone. A few taps later, a sleek black car pulled up to the curb. The driver stepped out, holding the door open for him. "Where to, Mr. Thompson?" he asked. "Back to the penthouse," Shaq replied, sliding into the plush leather seat. As the car pulled away, he leaned back and stared out the window, his mind still on Emily. He'd been conducting this experiment for weeks, posing as a homeless man to see how people would treat him. Some were kind, dropping spare change or offering a few words of encouragement. Others ignored him completely. But Emily, she was different. She'd gone out of her way to belittle him, to make him feel small, and that gave him an idea. When Shaq arrived at his penthouse, He headed straight for his office. The room was a testament to his success. Floor-to-ceiling windows, a mahogany desk, and shelves lined with awards and accolades. He sat down at his computer and began typing. He wasn't just going to teach Emily a lesson. He was going to change her life. The next morning, Emily woke up to the sound of her phone buzzing. She groaned, reaching for it on her nightstand. The screen lit up with a notification. "You've been invited to an exclusive charity gala hosted by Shaquille Thompson." Emily sat up, her heart racing. Shaquille Thompson. The Shaquille Thompson. She'd heard of him, of course. Everyone had. He was one of the most successful entrepreneurs in the country, a self-made millionaire who'd started with nothing and built an empire. But why would he invite her? She clicked on the notification, and her eyes widened as she read the details. The gala was that evening at the city's most luxurious hotel. The invitation was personalized, addressed to her by name. There was even a note. "Your presence is requested. Dress to impress." Emily's mind raced. This was her chance to rub shoulders with the elite, to network with people who could change her life. She didn't know how she'd gotten so lucky, but she wasn't about to question it. She jumped out of bed and began planning her outfit. What she didn't know was that this wasn't luck. It was a test, and she was about to fail spectacularly. The hotel ballroom was a vision of opulence. Crystal chandeliers sparkled overhead, their light reflecting off the polished marble floors. Waiters in tuxedos glided through the crowd, offering champagne and hors d'oeuvres on silver trays. The air was thick with the hum of conversation, the clink of glasses, and the occasional burst of laughter. Emily stood near the entrance, her heart pounding with excitement. She'd spent hours getting ready, her hair perfectly styled, her makeup flawless, her dress a sleek black number that hugged her curves in all the right places. She looked like she belonged here, among the city's elite. But as she scanned the room, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. She didn't recognize anyone. Not a single face in the crowd was familiar. Where were the celebrities, the influencers, the power players she'd expected to see? Instead, the room was filled with ordinary-looking people. Men in ill-fitting suits, women in modest dresses, even a few children running around. It was strange. Before she could dwell on it, a voice crackled over the loudspeaker. "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the annual Thompson Foundation Charity Gala. Please take your seats. The program is about to begin." Emily found her assigned table near the front of the room. The other guests at her table smiled politely, but didn't speak. She tried to strike up a conversation, but they seemed distracted, almost nervous. She brushed it off, assuming they were just as awestruck as she was. The lights dimmed, and a spotlight illuminated the stage. A man stepped into the light, and the room erupted into applause. Emily's breath caught in her throat. It was him, Shaquille Thompson. He was even more impressive in person than in the photos she'd seen. Tall, broad-shouldered, with a commanding presence that filled the room. He wore a tailored suit, his smile warm, but with a hint of something else. Something sharp. "Good evening, everyone," he began, his voice deep and resonant. "Thank you for being here tonight. This gala is more than just a fundraiser. It's a celebration of kindness, of compassion, of the power we all have to make a difference in someone's life." Emily clapped along with the crowd, but her mind was racing. Why was she here? What did he want with her? She couldn't shake the feeling that something big was about to happen. Shaq continued, his tone growing more serious. "But before we get to the main event, I'd like to share a story with you. A story about a man who was down on his luck, who'd lost everything and was struggling to survive. He sat on a street corner, day after day, asking for help. Most people walked past him. Some gave him a few coins. But one person went out of her way to mock him, to belittle him, to make him feel like he was nothing." Emily froze. Her stomach churned as a sinking feeling settled in her chest. Number it couldn't be. Shaq's gaze swept across the room, and for a moment his eyes locked with hers. "That man was me," he said, his voice steady. "And that woman is sitting in this room tonight." The crowd gasped. Emily's face burned with shame as every head in the room turned to look at her. She wanted to disappear, to sink into the floor and never come back. But there was no escape. Shaq stepped down from the stage and began walking toward her. The room was silent, the tension palpable. He stopped a few feet away, his expression unreadable. "Emily Carter," he said, his voice soft, but carrying the weight of 1,000 unspoken words. "Do you remember me?" She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. Her mind was a whirlwind of emotions: shame, anger, fear. How could she have been so blind? So cruel? Shaq didn't wait for an answer. He turned to the crowd and raised his voice. "Tonight, instead of focusing on what happened, I want to focus on what we can do to make things right. That's why I've decided to donate $1 million to the Thompson Foundation's Homeless Outreach Program, in Emily's name."
The room erupted into applause, but Emily felt like she'd been punched in the gut. This wasn't a victory. It was a punishment, a very public, very humiliating punishment. Shaq turned back to her, his expression softening. "Emily, I'm not doing this to shame you. I'm doing this to show you and everyone here that kindness matters, that every person, no matter their circumstances, deserves respect and compassion. I hope you'll take this as an opportunity to reflect, to grow, and to make better choices in the future." Emily nodded, tears streaming down her face. She didn't know what to say. She didn't know if there was anything she could say. As Shaq returned to the stage, the crowd rose to their feet in a standing ovation. But Emily stayed seated, her mind reeling. She'd come here expecting to network, to impress, to climb the social ladder. Instead, she'd been handed a lesson she'd never forget. The rest of the gala passed in a blur for Emily. She barely registered the speeches, the awards, the performances. All she could think about was Shaq's words, the way he looked at her, the way the crowd had stared. She felt exposed, vulnerable, and utterly alone. When the event finally ended, she made a beeline for the exit. But before she could leave, a hand on her arm stopped her. She turned to see Shaq standing there, his expression unreadable. "Emily," he said, his voice calm but firm, "I'd like to talk to you, in private." She nodded, too numb to argue. He led her to a small sitting room off the main ballroom, closing the door behind them. The room was quiet, the only sound the faint hum of the air conditioner. Shaq gestured for her to sit, then took a seat across from her. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Finally, he broke the silence. "How are you feeling?" Emily laughed bitterly. "How do you think I'm feeling? I just got publicly humiliated in front of a room full of people. I'm mortified." Shaq nodded, his expression sympathetic, but not apologetic. "I know it was harsh, but sometimes people need a wake-up call. You're not a bad person, Emily, but what you did, that wasn't okay." She looked down at her hands, tears welling up in her eyes. "I know. I don't even know why I said those things. I was just frustrated, I guess. But that's no excuse." Shaq leaned forward, his gaze intense. "Here's the thing, Emily. Life is hard, for everyone, but it's especially hard for people who don't have the advantages you do. The next time you're frustrated, I want you to remember how you felt tonight, and I want you to choose kindness." Emily nodded, her throat tight. "I will, I promise." Shaq studied her for a moment, then stood up. "Good. Then this wasn't for nothing." He handed her a business card. "If you ever want to talk, or if you're serious about making a change, give me a call. I'd be happy to help." Emily took the card, her hands trembling. "Thank you," she whispered. Shaq gave her a small smile, then turned and left the room. Emily sat there for a long time, staring at the card in her hands. She didn't know what the future held, but she knew one thing for sure. She would never be the same. The days following the gala were a blur for Emily. She avoided her usual haunts, the upscale coffee shops, the trendy gym, the high-end boutiques. She couldn't face the possibility of running into someone who'd been at the event, someone who'd witnessed her humiliation. Instead, she stayed home, replaying Shaq's words in her mind. Asterisk, choose kindness. Asterisk. It sounded so simple, but it felt like an impossible task. How could she change who she was? How could she undo years of entitlement, of privilege, of thinking she was better than everyone else? One evening, as she sat on her couch scrolling through social media, she came across a post from the Thompson Foundation. It was a video from a gala, highlighting the donation made in her name. The comments were brutal. Asterisk, who does she think she is? Asterisk. Asterisk, disgusting behavior. She deserves to be humiliated. Asterisk. Asterisk, people like her are the reason the world is so messed up. Asterisk. Emily closed the app, her hands shaking. She wanted to defend herself, to explain that she wasn't a bad person, that she was trying to change. But how could she, when even she didn't believe it yet? That's when she remembered the business card Shaq had given her. She dug through her purse until she found it, the word Shaquille Thompson, founder and CEO embossed in gold. She stared at it for a long time, then picked up her phone and dialed the number. It rang 3 times before he answered. Emily, he said, his voice calm and steady. I was wondering if you'd call. I didn't know who else to talk to, she admitted, her voice trembling. I don't know how to fix this. You don't have to fix it overnight, Shaq replied. Change takes time, but if you're serious about making a difference, I can help you get started. Emily took a deep breath. I want to do better. I don't know where to begin. Meet me tomorrow at 9 a.m., Shaq said. I'll text you the address. The next morning, Emily arrived at the address Shaq had sent her. It was a community center in a part of the city she'd never been to before. The building was modest but well kept, with a sign out front that read Asterisk Hope Haven, serving those in need. Asterisk. Shaq was waiting for her outside, dressed casually in jeans and a hoodie. He looked so different from a man she'd seen at the gala, approachable, almost ordinary. But there was still something commanding about him, something that made her feel both intimidated and inspired. Thanks for coming, he said, leading her inside. This is one of the places my foundation supports. We provide meals, job training, and other resources to people who are struggling. I thought it might be a good place for you to start. Emily nodded, her stomach churning with nerves. She didn't know what to expect, but she was determined to see it through. Inside, the community center was bustling with activity. Volunteers served breakfast to a line of people, while others helped sort donations or led workshops. Shaq introduced Emily to the center's director, a kind-faced woman named Maria. Emily's going to be volunteering with us for a while, Shaq explained. She's new to this, so go easy on her. Maria smiled warmly. We're happy to have you, Emily. Why don't you start by helping out in the kitchen? Emily nodded and followed Maria to the kitchen, where a group of volunteers was preparing sandwiches. She tied on an apron and got to work, her hands trembling as she spread mayonnaise on slices of bread. She felt out of place, like she didn't belong here. But as the morning went on, she began to relax. She struck up a conversation with one of the other volunteers, a college student named Jake. He told her about his passion for social work and his dream of opening his own nonprofit one day. Emily listened, fascinated by his dedication and humility. By the time her shift ended, she felt different, lighter somehow. She hadn't solved all her problems, but she'd taken the first step. And that was something. Over the next few weeks, Emily threw herself into her work at the community center. She volunteered every day, helping with everything from serving meals to tutoring kids. It wasn't easy, she was often exhausted, and there were moments when she wanted to give up. But she kept going, driven by a newfound sense of purpose. She also began to see the world differently. She noticed the small acts of kindness that she'd once taken for granted. The way a stranger held the door open for someone. The way a mother comforted her crying child. She started to appreciate the beauty in the ordinary, the strength in the struggle. One day, as she was helping serve lunch, she recognized one of the guests. It was the man she'd mocked on the street, the man she now knew was Shaq. He was back in his homeless disguise, sitting at a table with a group of people. Emily's heart raced as she approached him, a tray of food in her hands. Hi, she said, her voice trembling. Can I get you anything? Shaq looked up, his eyes hidden behind his sunglasses. For a moment, he didn't say anything. Then he smiled. Just a coffee, please. Black. Emily nodded and hurried to get his coffee. When she returned, she set it down in front of him, her hands shaking. I just wanted to say I'm sorry, she blurted out. For what I said that day. It was wrong and I regret it. Shaq studied her for a moment, then nodded. Thank you, Emily. That means a lot. She hesitated, then sat down across from him. Can I ask you something? Why do you do this? Why put yourself through all this? Humiliation. Shaq finished for her, his tone light. It's not about humiliation. It's about understanding. About seeing the world through someone else's eyes. And sometimes, it's about giving people a second chance. Emily nodded, her throat tight. I think I'm starting to understand. Shaq smiled. Good. That's the first step. Just as Emily was beginning to feel like she was making progress, something unexpected happened. One evening, as she was leaving the community center, she noticed a man lurking outside. He was dressed in a hoodie, his face partially hidden, and he seemed to be watching her. At first, she brushed it off, assuming he was just another guest at the center. But over the next few days, she kept seeing him, outside her apartment, at the coffee shop, even at the grocery store. He never approached her, but his presence was unnerving. Finally, she confronted him. Who are you? She demanded, her voice shaking. Why are you following me? The man hesitated, then pulled down his hood. Emily's breath caught in her throat. It was Jake, the college student she'd met at the community center. I'm sorry, he said, his voice low. I didn't mean to scare you. I needed to talk to you. Emily frowned. About what? Jake took a deep breath. It's about Shaq. There's something you need to know. Emily stared at Jake, her heart pounding. What are you talking about? What do I need to know about Shaq? Jake glanced around nervously, as if worried someone might overhear. Not here. Let's go somewhere private. Emily hesitated, but curiosity got the better of her. She followed Jake to a nearby park, where they found a quiet bench under a tree. The sun was setting, casting a golden glow over the city, but Emily barely noticed. Her mind was racing. Okay, she said, crossing her arms. What's going on? Jake took a deep breath. Shaq's not who you think he is. This whole thing, the homeless act, the gala, the community center, it's all part of a bigger plan. Emily frowned. What do you mean? What plan? Jake leaned closer, his voice dropping to a whisper. Shaq's not just testing people's kindness. He's using them. He's been manipulating people for years, setting up these elaborate schemes to expose their flaws and then exploiting them for his own gain. Emily's stomach churned. That doesn't make sense. Why would he do that? He's a millionaire. What could he possibly gain from humiliating people? Jake shook his head. It's not about money. It's about power, control. He gets off on seeing people at their lowest, on making them feel small. And then he swoops in like some kind of savior, offering them a way out, but only if they play by his rules. Emily's mind raced as she tried to process what Jake was saying. It didn't add up. Shaq had been kind to her, had given her a chance to change. But then again, she remembered the way he'd looked at her at the gala, the way he'd humiliated her in front of everyone. Was it possible that Jake was right? How do you know all this? She asked, her voice trembling. Jake hesitated, then sighed. Because I used to work for him. I was one of his projects. He pulled me out of a bad situation, made me feel like I owed him everything. But then I started noticing things, little things at first. The way he'd manipulate people, the way he'd twist their words and actions to suit his narrative. I tried to leave, but he wouldn't let me. He said I knew too much. Emily's heart sank. So why are you telling me this now? Jake looked her in the eye. Because I think you're different. I think you have the strength to stand up to him. But you need to be careful. Shaq's not someone you want to cross. Emily spent the next few days and days, torn between disbelief and fear. She wanted to believe that Shaq was the kind, generous man he appeared to be. But Jake's words haunted her, planting seeds of doubt that she couldn't ignore. She tried to go about her life as usual, volunteering at the community center and avoiding Shaq as much as possible. But it was hard to focus when her mind was constantly racing, replaying Jake's warning over and over again. One afternoon, as she was helping sort donations, Shaq showed up unexpectedly. He looked as confident as ever, his presence commanding the room. Emily's heart raced as he approached her. "Emily," he said, his voice warm but with an edge she hadn't noticed before. "How are you?" I'm fine," she stammered, avoiding his gaze. "Just busy." Shaq studied her for a moment, then nodded. "Good. I'm glad to see you're settling in. But there's something I need to talk to you about." Emily's stomach churned. "What is it?" Shaq glanced around, then gestured for her to follow him. They stepped outside, where the cool evening air offered a brief respite from the tension. Shaq leaned against the wall, his expression unreadable. "I've been hearing some interesting things about you," he said, his tone casual, but with an undercurrent of something darker. "Rumors that you've been asking questions, talking to people you shouldn't be talking to." Emily's heart skipped a beat. I don't know what you're talking about." Shaq's eyes narrowed. "Don't play dumb, Emily. I know you've been talking to Jake, and I know what he's been telling you." Emily's breath caught in her throat. "How do you know that?" Shaq smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "I know everything that happens in my world, and right now you're treading on very thin ice." Emily's mind raced. She wanted to run, to scream, to do anything but stand there and face him. But she forced herself to stay calm. "What do you want from me?" Shaq stepped closer, his voice low and menacing. "I want you to stop asking questions. I want you to forget everything Jake told you. And I want you to remember who's in charge here." Emily's heart pounded as she stared at him, her fear giving way to anger. "And if I don't?" Shaq's smile faded, replaced by a cold, hard expression. "Then you'll regret it." Emily didn't sleep that night. She lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, her mind racing. She felt trapped, caught between Shaq's threats and Jake's warnings. But as the hours passed, her fear began to give way to determination. She wasn't going to let Shaq control her. She wasn't going to let him win. The next morning, she went to the community center early, before anyone else arrived. She found Jake in the kitchen, preparing for the day's meals. He looked up in surprise when she walked in. "Emily," he said, his voice tense. "What are you doing here?" "I need your help," she said, her voice steady. "I'm not going to let Shaq get away with this. But I can't do it alone." Jake hesitated, then nodded. "What do you need?" Emily took a deep breath. "I need to know everything. Everything you know about Shaq, about what he's done, about how he operates. And then we're going to take him down." Jake studied her for a moment, then smiled. "I was hoping you'd say that." Emily and Jake sat in the back room of the community center, a stack of papers and a laptop spread out on the table between them. Jake had spent the past hour filling Emily in on everything he knew about Shaq, his past, his methods, and the people he'd manipulated over the years. "It's not just about humiliating people," Jake explained, his voice low. "Shaq's built an entire network of influence. He uses people's weaknesses against them, then pulls the strings from behind the scenes. He's got politicians, business leaders, even law enforcement in his pocket. If we're going to take him down, we need to be smart about it." Emily nodded, her mind racing. "So what's the plan? How do we expose him without getting ourselves killed?" Jake leaned forward, his eyes intense. "We need evidence. Solid, undeniable proof of what he's been doing. And we need to get it to someone who can't be bought or intimidated." "Like who?" Emily asked. "Like the media," Jake said. "If we can get this story out to the public, Shaq won't be able to silence everyone. But we need to be careful. One wrong move, and he'll shut us down before we even get started." Emily frowned. "How do we get the evidence? Shaq's not exactly going to hand it over." Jake smiled grimly. "That's where you come in. Shaq trusts you, or at least he thinks he does. If you can get close to him, maybe you can find something we can use." Emily's stomach churned at the thought of getting close to Shaq again. But she knew Jake was right. If they were going to pull this off, she'd have to play the part. "Okay," she said, taking a deep breath. "What do I need to do?" The next day, Emily called Shaq. Her hands trembled as she dialed his number, but she forced herself to stay calm. When he answered, his voice was as smooth and confident as ever. "Emily," he said, his tone warm but with a hint of suspicion. "What can I do for you?" "I've been thinking about what you said," she began, choosing her words carefully. "And I think you're right. I need to stop asking questions and focus on moving forward. I want to prove to you that I'm serious about changing." There was a pause on the other end of the line. Then Shaq chuckled. "I'm glad to hear that, Emily. I knew you had it in you. Why don't you come by my office tomorrow? We'll talk." Emily agreed, her heart pounding. She hung up and turned to Jake, who'd been listening in. "He bought it," she said, her voice shaky. Jake nodded. "Good. Now comes the hard part." Shaq's office was even more impressive in person than Emily had imagined. The walls were lined with bookshelves and framed awards, and the view from the floor-to-ceiling windows was breathtaking. But Emily barely noticed any of it. Her focus was on Shaq, who sat behind his massive desk, watching her with a calculating gaze. "Have a seat," he said, gesturing to the chair across from him. "I'm glad you came." Emily sat down, forcing herself to smile. "Thanks for seeing me. I wanted to apologize again for everything. I really am trying to do better." Shaq leaned back in his chair, studying her. "I believe you, and I think you have a lot of potential, Emily. But potential is nothing without direction. That's why I've decided to offer you a position at the foundation." Emily's eyes widened. "A position?" Shaq nodded. "I want you to be my personal assistant. You'll work closely with me, help me manage my projects, and learn the ins and outs of the organization. It's a big responsibility, but I think you're up to the task." Emily's mind raced. This was exactly the opportunity she needed to get closer to Shaq, but it was also a dangerous game. If he suspected anything, she'd be in serious trouble. I don't know what to say," she stammered. "Thank you. I won't let you down." Shaq smiled, but there was something cold in his eyes. "I know you won't." Over the next few weeks, Emily threw herself into her new role. She attended meetings, organized events, and handled Shaq's schedule with precision. She played the part of the loyal assistant perfectly, all while keeping her eyes and ears open for anything that could help her and Jake. It wasn't easy. Shaq was always watching, always testing her. But Emily was careful, never giving him a reason to doubt her loyalty. Then, one evening, as she was working late, she found something. Shaq had left his computer unlocked, and Emily couldn't resist the temptation to take a closer look. She opened a folder labeled Projects and began scrolling through the files. What she found made her blood run cold. There were documents detailing Shaq's manipulation of high-profile individuals, recordings of private conversations, and even evidence of blackmail. It was everything they needed to expose him. Emily quickly copied the files onto a flash drive, her hands trembling. She was about to close the folder when she heard a voice behind her. "Find anything interesting?" Emily froze. She turned slowly to see Shaq standing in the doorway, his expression unreadable. Emily's heart pounded as she stared at Shaq, her mind racing. She quickly pulled the flash drive from the computer and slipped it into her pocket, hoping he hadn't noticed. But the look in his eyes told her he had. I was just organizing your files," she stammered, forcing a smile. "You left your computer open, and I thought I'd help." Shaq stepped into the room, his expression calm, but with a dangerous edge. "Is that so? And what exactly were you organizing?" Emily's mouth went dry. She could feel the weight of the flash drive in her pocket, a ticking time bomb. "Just some old projects. I thought it might be helpful to have everything in one place." Shaq walked around the desk, his eyes never leaving hers. He leaned down, his face inches from hers, and whispered, "You're a terrible liar, Emily." She froze, her breath caught in her throat. Shaq straightened up and held out his hand. "Give it to me." Emily hesitated, her mind racing for a way out. But there was none. She reached into her pocket and handed him the flash drive, her hand trembling. Shaq examined it, then set it on the desk. "You've been busy, haven't you? Digging through my files, talking to Jake, plotting behind my back. Did you really think I wouldn't notice?" Emily's stomach churned. "How long have you known?" Shaq smiled coldly. "From the beginning. I knew Jake would try to turn you against me. and I knew you'd be foolish enough to listen." Emily's fear turned to anger. "You're a monster. You manipulate people, exploit their weaknesses, and then act like you're some kind of savior. But you're not. You're just a bully." Shaq's smile faded, replaced by a look of pure fury. He grabbed her arm, his grip like iron. "You have no idea what you're talking about. You think you're so clever, so righteous. But you're just like everyone else, weak, selfish, and desperate for someone to tell you what to do." Emily yanked her arm free, her anger giving her courage. "I'm not afraid of you, Shaq, and I'm not going to let you get away with this." Shaq laughed, a cold, hollow sound. "And how do you plan to stop me? You have no proof, no allies, no power. You're nothing." Emily glared at him, her mind racing. She knew he was right, she was outmatched. But she also knew she couldn't back down. "Not now. Maybe I am nothing," she said, her voice steady. "But I'd rather be nothing than be like you." Shaq's eyes narrowed, and for a moment, she thought he might hit her. But then he stepped back, his expression unreadable. "Get out," he said, his voice low and menacing. "And if I ever see you again, you'll regret it." Emily didn't need to be told twice. She grabbed her bag and ran out of the office, her heart pounding. She didn't stop until she was outside, the cool night air hitting her like a slap in the face. Emily went straight to Jake's apartment, her hands still shaking. She pounded on the door until he opened it, his eyes wide with alarm. "Emily, what's wrong?" She pushed past him into the apartment, her breath coming in short gasps. "He knows. Shaq knows everything." Jake's face paled. "What happened?" Emily told him everything. The files, the flash drive, the confrontation. When she finished, Jake sank onto the couch, his head in his hands. "This is bad," he muttered. "If Shaq knows we're onto him, he's not going to stop until he silences us." Emily sat down beside him, her mind racing. "We need to go to the police, or the media, someone who can protect us." Jake shook his head. "It's not that simple. Shaq's got connections everywhere. If we go to the wrong person, we're dead." Emily's heart sank. "So what do we do?" Jake looked at her, his expression grim. "We fight back. But we need to be smart about it. We need to find someone Shaq can't touch." The next morning, Emily and Jake met with a journalist named Sarah Collins. She was known for her investigative work, and she'd been trying to expose Shaq for years. But every time she got close, her sources disappeared or her stories got buried. "I've been waiting for someone like you," Sarah said, her eyes gleaming with determination. "Someone who's willing to take Shaq down, no matter the cost." Emily nodded, her resolve hardening. "We're in, but we need your help. We need to make sure this story gets out, no matter what." Sarah smiled. "Don't worry. If you can get me the evidence, I'll make sure the whole world sees it." Over the next few days, Emily, Jake, and Sarah worked tirelessly to gather the evidence they needed. They dug through public records, interviewed former associates, and pieced together a timeline of Shaq's crimes. It was risky, and every step brought them closer to danger. But they didn't stop. Finally, they had everything they needed: documents, recordings, and testimonies that painted a damning picture of Shaq's empire of manipulation. All that was left was to release it to the world. But as they prepared to send the files to Sarah's editor, Emily got a call. It was Shaq. "Emily," he said, his voice calm but with an edge of menace. "I know what you're planning, and I'm going to give you one last chance to walk away." Emily's heart raced, but she forced herself to stay calm. "It's over, Shaq. We've got everything. There's nothing you can do to stop us." Shaq laughed, a cold, hollow sound. "You really think you've won? You have no idea what you're up against. But if you want to play this game, fine. Let's see how far you get." The line went dead, and Emily's stomach churned. She knew Shaq wasn't bluffing, but she also knew she couldn't back down now. "It's time," she said, turning to Jake and Sarah. "Let's finish this." Emily, Jake, and Sarah sat in Sarah's apartment, the evidence spread out on the table in front of them. The files, recordings, and testimonies were ready to be sent to Sarah's editor, but they all knew the moment they hit send, there would be no turning back. "Once this goes public, Shaq's going to come after us with everything he's got," Jake said, his voice tense. We need to be ready. Emily nodded, her jaw set with determination. We've come too far to back down now. Let's do this. Sarah took a deep breath and clicked send. The files began uploading, the progress bar slowly filling. For a moment, the room was silent, the weight of what they were about to do hanging in the air. Then the lights went out. Emily's heart leapt into her throat as the room plunged into darkness. "What's happening?" she whispered, her voice trembling. "Stay calm," Jake said, though his voice was tight with fear. "It's probably just a power outage." But Emily knew better. This wasn't a coincidence. Shaq was here. The sound of footsteps echoed in the hallway outside, slow and deliberate. Emily's breath quickened as the doorknob rattled, then turned. The door creaked open, and a figure stepped inside. It was Shaq. He stood in the doorway, silhouetted by the faint light from the hallway. His expression was calm, almost amused, but his eyes burned with a cold, dangerous intensity. "You really thought you could beat me," he said, his voice low and menacing. "You're even more naive than I thought." Emily stood up, her legs shaking but her voice steady. "It's over, Shaq. The evidence is out. You can't stop it." Shaq smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Oh, Emily, you underestimate me. Do you really think I'd let something as trivial as evidence ruin everything I've built?" He stepped further into the room, and Emily noticed the glint of something in his hand, a gun. Her heart pounded as she realized just how dangerous this situation had become. "What are you going to do, Shaq?" Jake said, his voice shaking. "Shoot us? You'll never get away with it." Shaq chuckled, a cold, hollow sound. "You're right. I'm not going to shoot you, but I am going to make sure you never interfere with my plans again." He raised the gun, pointing it directly at Emily. She froze, her mind racing. This couldn't be how it ended. Not after everything they'd been through. Then, out of nowhere, Sarah lunged at Shaq, tackling him to the ground. The gun went off, the sound deafening in the small room. Emily screamed as Shaq and Sarah struggled, the gun skittering across the floor. "Get the gun," Sarah shouted, her voice strained. Emily didn't hesitate. She dove for the gun, her fingers closing around the cold metal, just as Shaq threw Sarah off him. He turned to Emily, his eyes blazing with fury. "Give it to me," he snarled, his voice low and dangerous. Emily's hands trembled as she pointed the gun at him, her heart pounding. "Stay back," she said, her voice shaking but firm. Shaq laughed, a cold, mocking sound. "You're not going to shoot me, Emily. You don't have it in you." For a moment, Emily hesitated. He was right. She didn't want to shoot him, but she also knew she couldn't let him win. Not after everything he'd done. Then, out of the corner of her eye, she saw Jake move. He grabbed a lamp from the table and swung it at Shaq's head. The impact was loud and sharp, and Shaq crumpled to the ground, unconscious. The room fell silent, the only sound the heavy breathing of Emily, Jake, and Sarah. Emily lowered the gun, her hands still shaking. "Is he?" she started, her voice barely above a whisper. "He's out," Jake said, his voice grim. "But we need to call the police. Now." The police arrived within minutes, their sirens piercing the night. They took Shaq into custody, his hands cuffed behind his back as he was led away. Emily, Jake, and Sarah gave their statements, the weight of what had happened still heavy on their shoulders. As the sun rose, the news broke. The evidence they'd gathered was everywhere. On the news, on social media, in the papers. Shaq's empire of manipulation was crumbling, and the world was watching. Emily stood outside the police station, the cool morning air a stark contrast to the chaos of the night before. Jake and Sarah joined her, their faces pale but relieved. "We did it," Sarah said, her voice filled with quiet triumph. "We actually did it." Emily nodded, but her mind was still racing. It's not over yet. Shaq's got connections. He's not going to go down without a fight. "Maybe," Jake said, his voice steady, "but we've got the truth on our side, and that's something he can't beat." Emily smiled, a small but genuine smile. For the first time in a long time, she felt a glimmer of hope. They'd taken on one of the most powerful men in the city and won. And no matter what happened next, she knew they'd done the right thing. In the weeks that followed, the fallout from Shaq's exposure was immense. His empire crumbled, his allies turned on him, and he was facing multiple charges that would likely put him behind bars for the rest of his life. Emily, Jake, and Sarah became heroes in the eyes of the public. They were interviewed, celebrated, and thanked by countless people who had been victims of Shaq's manipulation. But for Emily, the real victory was knowing she'd stood up to him and won. She continued volunteering at the community center, but now it was for a different reason. She wasn't trying to prove anything to anyone. She was doing it because it was the right thing to do. One evening, as she was leaving the center, she ran into Jake. He looked different, lighter, somehow, as if a weight had been lifted from his shoulders. "Hey," he said, smiling. "I was hoping I'd run into you." Emily smiled back. "Hey, what's up?" Jake hesitated, then said, "I just wanted to say thank you for everything. I couldn't have done this without you." Emily's heart warmed. "We did it together, and I couldn't have done it without you either." They stood there for a moment, the silence comfortable and familiar. Then Jake said, "So what's next for you?" Emily thought about it, then smiled. "I don't know, but for the first time in a long time, I'm excited to find out." The media frenzy surrounding Shaq's arrest and the exposure of his empire slowly began to die down, but the impact of what Emily, Jake, and Sarah had accomplished continued to ripple through the city. People who had once been afraid to speak out against Shaq now felt empowered to share their stories, and the community center became a hub for those seeking help and healing. Emily found herself at the center of it all, not as a figure of shame, but as a symbol of courage. She gave interviews, attended fundraisers, and even spoke at a few events, but she always made it clear that the real heroes were the people who had survived Shaq's manipulation and were now rebuilding their lives. One evening, as she was leaving the community center, she received a call from an unknown number. She hesitated, then answered. "Emily Carter?" a woman's voice asked. "Yes, this is Emily. This is Detective Martinez with the City Police Department. We've been going through Shaq's files, and we found something you might want to see." Emily's heart skipped a beat. "What is it?" "It's better if you come down to the station," Detective Martinez said. "Can you stop by tomorrow?" Emily agreed, her mind racing. What could they have found? And why did they want her to see it? The next morning, Emily arrived at the police station, her stomach in knots. Detective Martinez, a tall woman with sharp features and a no-nonsense demeanor, led her to a small room filled with boxes of files and evidence. "We've been combing through Shaq's records," Detective Martinez explained, "and we found something unusual. It seems he was working on a new project before his arrest. Something big." Emily frowned. "What kind of project?" Detective Martinez handed her a file. "Take a look." Emily opened the file and began to read. Her eyes widened as she realized what she was holding. It was a detailed plan for a new scheme, one that involved targeting high-profile politicians and business leaders. But what shocked her the most was the name at the top of the list. Hers. "He was going after me?" Emily asked, her voice trembling. Detective Martinez nodded. "It looks like he saw you as a threat long before you started digging into his past. He was planning to discredit you, ruin your reputation, and make sure no one would ever believe you." Emily's hands shook as she flipped through the pages. There were fake social media accounts, forged documents, and even a plan to plant evidence that would make her look like a criminal. If Shaq had succeeded, she would have been destroyed. "Why are you showing me this?" Emily asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Detective Martinez sighed. "Because we think you deserve to know. And because we think there might be others out there who were targeted but don't even realize it yet. We need your help to make sure no one else falls victim to his schemes." Emily nodded, her resolve hardening. "What do you need me to do?" Over the next few weeks, Emily worked closely with Detective Martinez and a team of investigators to uncover the full extent of Shaq's plans. They identified several people who had been targeted but hadn't yet been harmed, and they were able to warn them before it was too late. It was exhausting work, but Emily found it deeply fulfilling. For the first time in her life, she felt like she was making a real difference. She wasn't just fighting for herself anymore. She was fighting for everyone who had been hurt by Shaq and people like him. One evening, as she was leaving the police station, she ran into Jake. He looked tired but determined, and he smiled when he saw her. "Hey," he said, "I heard you've been busy." Emily smiled back. "You could say that. What about you? How are you holding up?" Jake shrugged. "It's been a lot, but I'm doing okay. I've been thinking, maybe it's time for me to start fresh. Leave all this behind and start over somewhere new." Emily's heart sank. She'd grown to rely on Jake, not just as an ally, but as a friend. The thought of him leaving was hard to swallow. "Where would you go?" she asked, trying to keep her voice light. Jake hesitated, then said, "I don't know. Maybe somewhere quiet. Somewhere I can figure out who I am without all this baggage." Emily nodded, her throat tight. "I get that. And if that's what you need, then I support you. But I'm going to miss you." Jake smiled, his eyes soft. "I'll miss you too, Emily. But this isn't goodbye. Not really. We'll always have this. What we did, what we accomplished. That's not going anywhere." Emily smiled back, tears welling up in her eyes. "You're right. And who knows? Maybe our paths will cross again someday." Jake nodded. "I'd like that." As the months passed, life began to settle into a new rhythm for Emily. She continued her work at the community center, but she also started writing about her experiences, sharing her story in the hopes of inspiring others to stand up against injustice. One day, as she was working on a new article, her phone buzzed with a text from Sarah. It was a link to a news article along with a message. "Thought you'd want to see this." Emily clicked the link and began to read. The article was about a new initiative to combat corruption and manipulation in the city, led by a coalition of activists, journalists, and law enforcement officials. At the top of the list of contributors was Sarah's name and Emily's. She smiled, a sense of pride swelling in her chest. They'd come so far, and they were just getting started. As she sat there, her phone buzzed again. This time, it was a message from an unknown number. She opened it, her heart skipping a beat as she read the words, "You did good, Emily. But the fight's not over. Stay sharp." Emily stared at the message, her mind racing. Who had sent it? And what did they mean? She didn't have the answers, but she knew one thing for sure. She was ready for whatever came next. Emily stood on the rooftop of the community center, looking out over the city. The sun was setting, casting a golden glow over the skyline. It was a beautiful sight, but it was also a reminder of how much work still needed to be done. She thought about everything she'd been through, the humiliation, the fear, the triumph. She thought about Jake, about Sarah, about all the people who had stood by her side. And she thought about the future, about the battles yet to come. She didn't know what lay ahead, but she knew one thing for sure. She was ready. Ready to fight, ready to grow, ready to make a difference. And as she stood there, watching the sun dip below the horizon, she felt a sense of peace. The road ahead wouldn't be easy, but she was ready to walk it. Because she wasn't just Emily Carter anymore. She was a fighter, a survivor, a force to be reckoned with. And she was just getting started. Emily had just finished giving a speech at a local charity event when she noticed a man lingering near the back of the room. He was tall, with sharp features and a piercing gaze that made her uneasy. She tried to brush it off, assuming he was just another attendee, but something about him felt off. As she made her way to the exit, the man approached her. "Emily Carter," he said, his voice smooth but with an edge. "I've been following your work. Impressive." Emily forced a smile, her guard up. "Thank you. And you are?" "A friend," he said, his tone cryptic. "Or, at least I could be, if you're willing to listen." Emily's instincts screamed at her to walk away, but curiosity got the better of her. "What do you want?" The man leaned in slightly, his voice dropping to a whisper. "Shaq wasn't working alone. There are others, people who are just as dangerous, if not more so. And they're not happy with what you've done." Emily's heart raced, but she kept her expression neutral. "If you have information, take it to the police. I'm not getting involved in this." The man chuckled, a cold, humorless sound. "The police can't help you with this, Emily. But I can. If you're smart, you'll hear me out." Before she could respond, he handed her a business card and walked away, disappearing into the crowd. Emily stared at the card, her mind racing. It was blank except for a phone number. That night, Emily sat in her apartment, the business card on the table in front of her. She'd been staring at it for hours, torn between curiosity and caution. Finally, she picked up her phone and dialed the number. It rang twice before a familiar voice answered. "Emily, I was hoping you'd call." It was the man from the event. Emily's stomach churned, but she forced herself to stay calm. "Who are you, and what do you want?" "My name is Victor," he said, "and what I want is to help you. But first, you need to understand what you're up against." Emily frowned. "What are you talking about?" Victor sighed. Shaq was just one piece of a much larger puzzle. There's an entire network of people like him, powerful, connected, and ruthless. They've been operating in the shadows for years, manipulating people and systems to their advantage. And now that you've taken down one of their own, they're coming for you. Emily's heart pounded, but she tried to keep her voice steady. "Why are you telling me this? What's in it for you?" Victor hesitated, then said, "Let's just say I have my reasons. And if you're willing to work with me, I can help you take them down." Emily's mind raced. She didn't trust Victor, not by a long shot. But she also knew she couldn't ignore the threat he was describing. "What do you need from me?" "Meet me tomorrow," Victor said. "I'll explain everything. But come alone, and don't tell anyone." The line went dead, and Emily sat there, her mind spinning. She didn't know what to do, but she knew one thing for sure. She couldn't do this alone. The next day, Emily arrived at the address Victor had given her, a rundown warehouse on the outskirts of the city. She told Jake and Sarah about the call, and they'd insisted on coming with her, but she'd refused. This was her fight, and she wasn't going to put them in danger. As she stepped inside the warehouse, she saw Victor standing in the middle of the room, his hands in his pockets. He smiled when he saw her. "I'm glad you came." Emily crossed her arms, her guard up. "Cut the small talk. What do you want?" Victor's smile faded, replaced by a serious expression. "I want to take down the network, and I need your help to do it." Emily frowned. "Why me? What makes you think I can help you?" Victor studied her for a moment, then said, "Because you've already done what no one else could. You took down Shaq. And if we're going to succeed, we'll need that kind of determination." Emily shook her head. "I'm not a hero, Victor. I just did what I had to do." Victor smiled, but there was something cold in his eyes. "Maybe. But you're the closest thing we've got." Over the next few weeks, Emily worked with Victor to uncover the truth about the network. It was a dangerous game, and every step brought them closer to danger. But as they dug deeper, they began to piece together a picture of an organization that was more powerful and more dangerous than Emily had ever imagined. The network was made up of politicians, business leaders, and even law enforcement officials. They operated in the shadows, manipulating systems and people to their advantage. And they were ruthless, willing to do whatever it took to protect their interests. Emily knew they were in over their heads, but she also knew they couldn't back down. Not now. Just as they were about to take their findings to the authorities, Emily discovered the truth about Victor. He wasn't trying to take down the network. He was part of it. And he'd been using her to eliminate his competition. Emily's heart sank as she realized the truth. She'd been played again. But this time, she wasn't going to let it slide. Emily confronted Victor, her anger giving her courage. "You used me," she said, her voice trembling with rage. "You lied to me." Victor smiled, but there was no warmth in his eyes. "I did what I had to do. And now, it's time for you to disappear." Emily's heart pounded, but she stood her ground. "I'm not going anywhere, and I'm not going to let you win." Victor's smile faded, replaced by a look of pure fury. "You really think you can stop me? You're just one person, Emily, and you're out of your depth." Emily glared at him, her resolve hardening. "Maybe, but I'd rather go down fighting than let people like you win." In the end, Emily managed to expose Victor and the network, but it came at a cost. She was left scarred, both physically and emotionally, but she knew she'd done the right thing. As she stood on the rooftop of the community center, looking out over the city, she felt a sense of peace. The road ahead wouldn't be easy, but she was ready to walk it. Because she wasn't just Emily Carter anymore. She was a fighter, a survivor, a force to be reckoned with. Emily sat in her apartment, staring at the wall. The confrontation with Victor had left her shaken, but it had also ignited a fire within her. She had exposed part of the network, but she knew it was only the tip of the iceberg. There were still powerful people out there, people who would stop at nothing to protect their secrets. Her phone buzzed, snapping her out of her thoughts. It was a text from Sarah. *, we need to talk. Meet me at the usual spot. *. Emily grabbed her coat and headed out, her mind racing. What now? Had Sarah found something new? Or was this about Victor? Emily arrived at the small cafe where she and Sarah often met. Sarah was already there, sitting at a corner table with a man Emily didn't recognize. He was in his late 30s, with sharp features and an air of quiet confidence. *Emily, this is Marcus," Sarah said as Emily sat down. "He's a journalist, like me, but he specializes in organized crime. He's been investigating the network for years." Marcus nodded, his expression serious. "I've been following your work, Emily. What you did with Shaq and Victor, it's impressive. But you're in over your head." Emily frowned. "What do you mean?" Marcus leaned forward, his voice low. "The network isn't just a group of corrupt individuals. It's a system, a carefully constructed web of power and influence that spans across industries, governments, and borders. Taking them down won't be easy. But if you're willing to work with me, I can help you." Emily hesitated. She didn't know if she could trust Marcus, but she also knew she couldn't do this alone. "What's your plan?" Marcus smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "First, we need to find their weak spot, and I think I know where to start." Marcus's plan was risky, but it was their best shot. The network had a central hub, a secret facility, where they stored their most sensitive information. If they could infiltrate it and retrieve the data, they could expose the entire organization. But getting in wouldn't be easy. The facility was heavily guarded, with state-of-the-art security systems and a team of highly trained operatives. They would need a team of their own, people with the skills and resources to pull it off. Emily reached out to Jake, who had been laying low since his decision to start fresh. To her surprise, he agreed to help. "I told you I was done with this," he said over the phone. "But if you're going after the network, count me in." With Jake on board, they began assembling their team. Sarah used her connections to recruit a hacker named Priya, who could bypass the facility's security systems. Marcus brought in a former Special Forces operative named Diaz, who had the combat skills they would need. The plan was set. They would infiltrate the facility under the cover of darkness, retrieve the data, and get out before anyone knew they were there. It sounded simple, but Emily knew it would be anything but. The night of the operation, they gathered at a safe house on the outskirts of the city. The tension was palpable as they went over the plan one last time. "Remember," Marcus said, his voice steady. "Stick to the plan, and we'll get out of this alive. Deviate and we're all dead." Emily nodded, her heart pounding. She didn't know if they would succeed, but she knew they had to try. The facility was a sprawling complex, surrounded by high walls and barbed wire. They approached from the east, using the cover of darkness to avoid detection. Priya hacked into the security system, disabling the cameras and alarms, while Diaz took out the guards with silent precision. They made their way inside, moving quickly and quietly through the corridors. The facility was eerily quiet, the only sound the hum of the fluorescent lights overhead. Finally, they reached the server room. Priya got to work, her fingers flying over the keyboard as she downloaded the data. Emily stood guard, her heart racing as she listened for any sign of trouble. Then the alarms went off. The sound was deafening, echoing through the corridors like a siren. Emily's heart leapt into her throat as she realized they'd been discovered. "We need to go," Diaz shouted, his voice barely audible over the noise. Priya grabbed the flash drive and shoved it into her pocket. "Got it. Let's move." They ran, the sound of footsteps and shouting echoing behind them. Diaz led the way, taking out guards as they went, while Priya hacked into the security system to slow their pursuers. They reached the exit just as a group of armed guards appeared, blocking their path. Diaz engaged them, his movements swift and precise, while Emily and the others made a break for the fence. They climbed over, their hands bleeding from the barbed wire, and ran into the woods. The sound of gunfire echoed behind them, but they didn't stop until they reached the safe house. Back at the safe house, they gathered around the laptop as Priya plugged in the flash drive. The data was encrypted, but it didn't take long for her to crack it. What they found was staggering. The network's reach was far greater than they'd imagined, with connections to governments, corporations, and even international organizations. The data contained names, dates, and details of their operations, everything they needed to bring them down. But as they scrolled through the files, Emily noticed something that made her blood run cold. There was a file with her name on it. Emily opened the file, her hands trembling. It was a detailed dossier on her background, her family, her friends. There were photos, transcripts of conversations, and even notes on her habits and routines. But what shocked her the most was the note at the bottom. Asterisk, subject poses significant threat. Eliminate if necessary. Asterisk. Emily's heart pounded as she realized the truth. The network had been watching her long before she'd even heard of Shaq. And they weren't going to stop until she was gone. Emily sat in silence, her mind racing. She knew what she had to do. She couldn't let the network win, but she also knew it would come at a cost. She turned to the others, her voice steady. We need to release this data. All of it. No matter what happens. Marcus nodded, his expression grim. It's risky, but it's the only way. Jake put a hand on her shoulder. We're with you, Emily. Whatever happens, we're in this together. Emily smiled, a sense of determination filling her. They were ready, and so was she. The next morning, the data was released to the public. It was everywhere, on the news, on social media, in the papers. The network's secrets were exposed for the world to see, and the fallout was immediate. But as the world reacted, Emily knew the fight wasn't over. The network was powerful, and they wouldn't go down without a fight. As Emily stood on the rooftop of the community center, looking out over the city, she felt a sense of peace. The road ahead wouldn't be easy, but she was ready to walk it. Because she wasn't just Emily Carter anymore. She was a fighter, a survivor, a force to be reckoned with. The release of the network's data sent shockwaves across the globe. Governments toppled, corporations crumbled, and powerful individuals were arrested or went into hiding. The media dubbed it the Great Exposure, and Emily, Jake, Sarah, Marcus, and Priya were hailed as heroes. But for Emily, the victory felt hollow. The network was fractured, but it wasn't destroyed. And the people who had been part of it, those who had escaped arrest, were now more dangerous than ever. One evening, as Emily was leaving the community center, she noticed a black SUV parked across the street. The windows were tinted, and the engine was running. Her heart raced as she realized she was being watched. She quickened her pace, her mind racing. Who was in the car? Were they following her? And what did they want? The next morning, Emily received a package at her apartment. It was a small box, wrapped in plain brown paper, with no return address. Her hands trembled as she opened it. Inside was a single item, a bullet polished to a shine, with a note attached. The note read, asterisk, you should have stayed out of this. Asterisk. Emily's heart pounded as she realized the truth. The network wasn't done with her, and they were sending a message. Emily called an emergency meeting with Jake, Sarah, Marcus, and Priya. They gathered at a safe house Marcus had arranged, their faces grim as Emily showed them the bullet and the note. This is bad, Marcus said, his voice low. If they're sending threats, it means they're still active, and they're coming after us. Jake frowned. What do we do? We can't just sit here and wait for them to make the next move. Sarah nodded. We need to strike back, but we need to be smart about it. Priya, who had been quiet until now, spoke up. I've been analyzing the data we retrieved. There's a name that keeps popping up, someone who seems to be at the center of everything. If we can take them down, we might be able to cripple the network for good. Emily leaned forward, her heart racing. Who is it? Priya hesitated, then said, his name is Elias Kane. He's a billionaire tech mogul, but he's also the network's financier. Without him, they'll lose their funding and their power. The plan was simple in theory, but nearly impossible in practice. Elias Kane was one of the most powerful and protected men in the world. Getting close to him would require resources, connections, and a level of risk none of them had faced before. But they didn't have a choice. If they didn't act, the network would regroup, and they would come after Emily and her team with everything they had. Marcus used his connections to get them invitations to a high-profile charity gala, where Kane would be speaking. It was their best chance to get close to him. The gala was a glittering affair, filled with celebrities, politicians, and business leaders. Emily felt out of place in her borrowed gown, but she forced herself to stay focused. Kane was here, and they had one shot to take him down. As Kane took the stage to give his speech, Emily and Jake moved into position. Priya had hacked into the venue's security system, giving them access to the backstage area. Marcus and Sarah were outside, ready to provide backup if things went south. Emily's heart pounded as she and Jake made their way to Kane's private suite. They had to move quickly. If they were caught, it would all be over. They found Kane in his suite, surrounded by bodyguards. Emily's stomach churned as she realized how outmatched they were. But before she could second-guess herself, Jake stepped forward. Elias Kane, he said, his voice steady. We need to talk. Kane turned, his expression calm, but with a dangerous edge. And who might you be? Emily stepped forward, her heart racing. We're the people who took down your network, and we're not done yet. Kane smiled, but there was no warmth in it. You're brave, I'll give you that. But you're also foolish. Do you really think you can stop me? Before Emily could respond, the door burst open, and a group of armed men stormed in. Emily's heart sank as she realized they'd been set up. The next few minutes were a blur. Jake grabbed Emily's hand and pulled her toward the window, while Marcus and Sarah burst in from the other side, guns drawn. A firefight erupted, the sound of gunfire echoing through the suite. Emily and Jake climbed out the window and onto the fire escape, their hearts pounding as they made their way down. Marcus and Sarah followed, covering their escape. They reached the ground just as the sound of sirens filled the air. They ran, disappearing into the night before the police could arrive. Back at the safe house, they regrouped, their faces grim. They'd failed to take down Kane, but they'd learned something important. He was the key to the network, and they couldn't stop until he was gone. Emily sat in silence, her mind racing. She knew the road ahead would be dangerous, but she also knew they couldn't back down. Not now. The next day, Emily received a call from an unknown number. She hesitated, then answered. Emily Carter, a woman's voice asked. Yes, Emily said, her heart racing. My name is Dr. Lena Hart. I'm a former associate of Elias Kane, and I think I can help you. Dr. Hart met with Emily and her team at the safe house. She was in her 50s, with sharp features and an air of quiet authority. She explained that she had worked for Kane for years, but she'd left after discovering the truth about his involvement in the network. Kane is more dangerous than you realize, Dr. Hart said. He's not just a financier. He's the architect of the network, and he's planning something big. Emily frowned. What kind of something? Dr. Hart hesitated, then said, he's developing a new technology, a system that would give him complete control over the world's information. If he succeeds, he'll be unstoppable. Emily and her team knew they had to act fast. With Dr. Hart's help, they devised a plan to infiltrate Kane's research facility and destroy the technology before it could be completed. It was their most dangerous mission yet, but they didn't have a choice. If they failed, the world would pay the price. The infiltration was a success, but it came at a cost. They managed to destroy the technology, but Kane escaped, and he wasn't happy. As they stood in the ruins of the facility, Emily knew the fight wasn't over. Kane was still out there, and he would stop at nothing to rebuild his empire. But she also knew they'd made a difference. They'd struck a blow against the network, and they'd shown that even the most powerful people could be brought down. As Emily stood on the rooftop of the community center, looking out over the city, she felt a sense of peace. The road ahead wouldn't be easy, but she was ready to walk it, because she wasn't just Emily Carter anymore. She was a fighter, a survivor, a force to be reckoned with.